Honorable Vance Amory, Senior Minister with responsibility for Labor and Social Security. I also recognize Minister Hamilton, Minister Phipps, PS, well, he was here a little earlier, PS Labor and Social Security, Mr. Reginald Thomas, Dr. Dillat Mora, Mr. Walters, Chairman of the Social Security Board here, CARICOM Heads of Social Security, Ms. Rosa May Whittier, CARICOM CSME Unit, officials of Social Security schemes, invited guests, other staff members of Social Security boards, invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Right, and if I missed anybody, welcome. So I want to thank the CARICOM Heads of Social Security for their kind invitation to share some thoughts on the sustainability of Social Security schemes in the Caribbean. That's what they've asked me to speak on. Now, by the way, I don't know that I know anything more about Social Security than you guys. You are the experts. But for whatever reason, they've asked me to share a few words, and I will do that. So be careful what you ask for. Before I proceed, permit me to congratulate the St. Christopher and Nevis Social Security Board on the attainment of your 40th anniversary. That is indeed a milestone. You are coming of age, and the development footprint of the board is etched indelibly in the Federation wherever you go. And you are to be commended for that milestone. Let's give them a round of applause again, please. So I've put up a few slides there just to keep you engaged so that you don't fall asleep on me. Some people like movies, so hopefully there'll be a couple pictures there that might be of interest. Our meeting convenes at a time when global growth is projected around 3.9% this year and next year. However, risks abound, including trade wars, rising global prices, of course except for Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, and climate change. Growth in CARICOM is still too low and too slow, with growth projected between 1 and 2% for this year and next year. Within the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, we're actually projecting about 2.7% this year and about 3.5% next year. Low growth, aging populations, and high unemployment are weighing on most of our social security schemes. Against this backdrop, it comes as no surprise that the sustainability of these schemes is a question that preoccupies the minds of heads of Social Security. But lest you think you are all alone and feel a little sorry for yourselves, I want to assure you that you are not alone, because people like me are also preoccupied with the issue of sustainability, and maybe that's why I was asked to say a few words on this subject. So in this address, I propose to do three things. First, to highlight the criticality of Social Security systems and the link with government's fiscal situation. Second, to identify global trends and regional challenges that impinge on sustainability. And third, to offer a few recommendations. So, three key messages. The first is this: the adoption of fiscal resilience frameworks by governments is critical to help safeguard the sustainability of social security schemes. Fiscal resilience frameworks. Second, governments and social security schemes ought to adopt a sense of urgency about implementation of key reforms by publishing time-bound action plans and annual progress reports. And my third message is, so touch your neighbor and say, act now. Touch your neighbor and say, act now. Good. And the third collective message is this: collective action as a region is essential to manage risk and seize opportunities, because they're both, that confront social security schemes. Collective action is critical to manage risk and opportunities that confront our social security schemes. So let me talk about the criticality of social security schemes and make the link with government's fiscal situation. Most of you know that all of us appreciate the power and the impact of Social Security on our economies and on our communities. In CARICOM, Social Security as a percentage of reserves of GDP is around 24%. So almost quarter. If you think about the size of our CARICOM GDP, the reserves of our CARICOM Social Security systems are about 24%. Within the ECCU, it's around 34%. So almost a third. That's the size. So let's take a look at this. Let's look at the ECCU, and you will see some stylized facts. 1/3 of GDP. Folks, you are managing 1/3 of our national income as a regional economy. The reserves under your management constitute 1/3 of our regional economy. For those of you who are in the ECCU. For those of you who come from the CARICOM wide area, you are managing about a fourth, a quarter. So you are extremely important. And it has been said, and it must be reiterated, much depends on you. Take a look at deposits to GDP in the ECCU, 9.5%. Now that's an average. But I can tell you there are banks in the ECCU or countries in the ECCU where that number is closer to 30%. So while I'm going to speak about sustainability and I'm going to talk about the fiscal situation and so on and make the connection, I could easily spend time talking about the link with financial stability. So when I come to this issue this morning, I am not simply talking about benefits. Of course, that is your primary function and you have a social contract with the people to deliver benefits. But there are implications for financial stability because of the level of reserves. The fact of the matter is, most of the liquidity or a significant line of the liquidity in our banks comes from social security schemes. And if you look at the regional government securities market, which is a market that the ECCU governments use to raise money, treasury bills and bonds, 9.3% of GDP. And I can tell you in the ECCU, the governments have raised over $12 billion over the last 15, 16 years from this market. And social security schemes have played a very important part. So those are just some stylized facts for ECCU. If we take a look at CARICOM, what you will see is what I just said, 24%. And then if you look at the other numbers are really about some of the benefits and the distribution. So you look at replacement rates, and they vary between 33.5% as much as high as 70%, I think, in Dominica. Janice? It's now 60, so you've gone to 60, which is probably closer to the average, of course. And then you look at eligibility, it's around average 63 years. So some schemes are at 60, some are as high as 70, I am advised, but the average is somewhere around 63. But those are just some stylized facts. Most of that you probably already know, but it's just to give a context for what I'm going to share with you this morning. So when we look at administrative costs, those costs are now averaging around 18%, with some countries over 20%. There's one country I looked at that's as high as 26%. So we have an issue with costs. I remember Derek Osborne saying some time ago, there are 4 ingredients of a good system, and some of you have heard him say that many times, and I really like that. 1 is what? Healthy and growing economies. 2 is what? Well-designed systems. 3 is what? Efficient administration. And 4 is honest and transparent government. Now, let's assume we have honest and transparent government. We have 3 ministers here, so we'll make that assumption. I see them nodding in agreement. Let's go back to the top. Healthy and growing economies. Well, I just told you the economies are just starting to recover from the global financial crisis. And 1 and 2% could hardly be described as healthy and growing. Barely. But it's a start. Well-designed? Not quite. Not quite. And a lot of the discussion about reforms of the system have to do with the design or the lack of adapting the design of the schemes. And then the third one is the question of efficiency. And when we look at some of the cost ratios, clearly administration costs are too high. Those are realities, and I'm not here to cast aspersions. I want to say I respect what you do. I value what you do, heads of Social Security and your colleagues, and I'm not here to cast aspersions. I'm merely pointing to the fact that clearly there are a few things we need to do and do together. So as we think about health insurance, for example, and many of our countries are discussing health insurance now, it might be an opportune time to spread some of those costs across your existing administration, understanding, of course, that there has to be a separate contribution for health insurance. In other words, it has to be funded. But that with your existing apparatus, both staff and investment frameworks, you might be in a position to deliver service and in so doing, improve the cost efficacy of the schemes. And that's something you want to keep in mind because many of our governments are talking now about health insurance. I must tell you, when I was preparing to share some thoughts on this, I found the lack of data a little troubling. Now, all of you will tell me, Governor, we present our actual reports and we present our annual financial reports to our government and to Parliament. And I'm not taking dispute with that. The question is, how timely is that? And I found going to some of the websites, it is not as timely as it ought to be. And I don't know why in 2018 that should be an issue. Social security schemes, we are called to a very high standard of corporate governance. And we need to have these reports published early and on time for all to see. In the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, we are mandated by law to produce our annual report, including audited financial statement, 3 months after the end of our financial year. So our board meeting on Friday of this week will approve our financial statements, I anticipate, having got the auditors back, and we will publish that by the end of June and publish on our website. And we can't fail. In fact, because we have to do that by law and because we understand the importance of what we do and the public interest in this matter, we produce weekly financial statements. Now, I'm not asking you to do that because that requires a certain level of effort within the organization. But surely, we cannot be seeing these reports 2 and 3 years after the fact. Because I think in so doing, we are missing an opportunity for an early and effective engagement with our leaders, political leaders, as well as our contributors, the general public, on these issues of reform. So let's give ourselves a better chance by publishing early. And I know some of you say, well, what difference does it make? But I think that's a starting point for the conversation that we have to have about reforms of these schemes to ensure this sustainability. Now, the connection with the fiscal situation. All of you would appreciate that the governments are the largest contributors to our social security schemes, yes? And also, in many cases, the largest borrower. Why are you so reluctant to say yes? Are you ashamed? That's a fact. We have to just acknowledge a fact. Now, there are some countries where government is so exposed, or they are so exposed to government that as much as 70% of the portfolio are invested in government securities. I'm not calling name. This is not a name and shaming session. So relax. See, some people got a little tense when I started to go there. I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I'm here to engage us on a way to move forward to secure, because you know what? When you think about it, social security is probably the most important social programs our governments have ever designed. Just think about it. Because I treat education separately. I see education as an investment. So I'm not speaking of education. But social protection and what you hold in your hand, of which you are the custodians, is perhaps the single most important social programs designed by our governments. And therefore, I agree with Minister we cannot fail. We cannot fail. But having said that, I'm less concerned about failing than about having to take action to save the thing at the 99th hour when we are, in so doing, could visit hardship on people. And that is why I argue for timely adjustments to the schemes. If in most, if not all of the legal frameworks of our social security schemes, government has an explicit role to step in and ensure that the schemes are able to deliver benefits. Yes? Correct. So that's what is in government essentially contingent liabilities. I don't know how many governments realize that, but that's the reality. That has direct implications for fiscal and debt sustainability. In the event that governments are required to intervene, their response will be predicated by fiscal space. And it is no secret that many of our governments in this region have little or no fiscal space. So faced with an intervention, what is going to happen? The governments will have to increase debt. We already know that we are already highly indebted as a region. Increase taxes. Nobody particularly likes that. Debt restructuring. Some of us have been through that difficult experience. And or reduce benefits. And in a worst case scenario, all four. All four. Consequently, in my humble estimation, our governments must put their fiscal houses in order. I want to repeat that. Our governments ought to put their fiscal houses in order. Folks, I am not coming to you this morning in any self-righteous way. I have been a financial secretary for many years. And yes, Mr. Bailey, I know how to limbo dance. Because any financial secretary working in some of the Google economies that we had after the global financial crisis knows exactly what that is like. And for me, I had to draw on my faith during those very exceptionally difficult years. So I understand. So I'm not here to preach. I will do that somewhere else at a different time. My point is, my call for fiscal resilience, sometimes referred to as fiscal responsibility, is really an appeal to give, as I said last week at the CDB annual meetings, to give small island developing states like ourselves a fighting chance to survive in a very hostile global economy pregnant with risks, of which climate change is a particularly obvious one. And so I've said, and I repeat, after the global financial crisis, the situation was made far worse in many of our countries, including my own where I was at the time, because there was no fiscal space. And when governments ought to have been spending more to cushion the effect on the population, our government was spending less. They were cutting capital expenditure, and in so doing, hurting growth and hurting the economy. But they didn't do that because they were wicked and insensitive. They did it because there was no fiscal space. And so what we did subsequently, and I go back to my time in Grenada for a minute, to enact fiscal responsibility legislation was directly coming out of that understanding and recognizing that we had to build some buffers. Because you see, we can look at the economy and have all our great and grand plans. But when we get a Irma or Maria, as Dominica knows only too well, and Anguilla, that changes everything. And that's the point I make. So sometimes when I hear people are having the discussion about their grand plans, I am making the point, some things are outside of our control. We hope for a relatively mild season, one that does not hurt us too much like last year, but who knows? The question is, that is not within our control. And what we have to focus on as policymakers and as practitioners is what is within our control. That's the only thing we can touch. And then after that, we must exercise our faith. But as I always say, hope is an anchor of the soul. Hope is not a strategy. There's a difference, folks. And I'm a man of faith. It is not a strategy. It is not a strategy. It is an anchor of the soul. And God knows we all need hope. But we have to put things in place within our control to make life better for the people we serve. And so that's my appeal. So I'm very pleased, for example, to know that the Bahamas, only I think this week, table legislation for fiscal responsibility legislation. Is anybody here from the Bahamas? Very good. I'm pleased. And in Jamaica, the new finance minister, Dr. Nigel Clark, announced a couple weeks ago the establishment of a fiscal council. And of course, Grenada has its own already set up. Anguilla has already set up. I know the case of the government of St. Kitts and Nevis is actively considering its options in that area, and hopefully others are as well. I make an appeal. And I'm making the appeal to say we have to have common cause about why this is important now. Because we have to see the link between the fiscal situation and the social security scheme's sustainability. If the governments cannot pay, contributions will not be paid on time. They will accrue, arrears will accrue. If the governments cannot have no fiscal space, the law will say they have to step in, but stepping in will create its own set of issues. So we need healthy fiscal accounts. And it starts with not when the things improve, not when the economy gets better. It starts with a decision that we will put our fiscal house in order and we will manage a certain way. Folks, if you see my passion and feel it, it's because I've been there and I understand. I say no more. Let's move on. So I now want to talk about, briefly, the global trends and regional challenges. And that will be then lead me into final recommendations. So the International Social Security Association, ISSA, one of the world's leading international organizations for social security, in 2016 published 10 challenges affecting sustainability of social security systems globally. And I want to highlight 5, because 5 of those, I think, resonate particularly with the Caribbean, with our CARICOM countries. First, coverage is improving, but there's room for improvement. And as I'm thinking about that, I recall a paper that Derek Osborne wrote for CARICOM back in 2004. And at that time, Derek made the observation that the greatest failing of social security schemes was a lack of coverage of self-employed persons. And so, Minister, while you are right that the expansion of the economy potentially redounds to social security, that is a necessary but not sufficient condition. There has to be the apparatus, incentives, and compliance systems to ensure that when there is a good dividend in the economies, social security actually receives a dividend, an increase, a boost in contribution income. It is not a foregone conclusion that will happen if the systems are not in place. When Derek, if you excuse me, Derek, I think we all know Derek, wrote that paper, most countries were covering less than 10% of those who were self-employed. I think Barbados at the time was around 25%. Anybody from Barbados here? Nobody. Everybody's busy, hunkered down, things to do at home. We understand. And we wish Barbados well. We wish Barbados well. But how much progress have we made? I could not get a number to see, 14 years later, where are we now? But I would love to hope, but I need to see the numbers because we have to work with data, whether and to what extent we have doubled or even tripled that coverage for self-employed. So if I ask anyone I've heard of Social Security, I won't put you on the spot. What's your coverage of self-employed in your country now? Can you tell me with confidence what that number is? Can you? Good. Oh, that's good. So somebody, give me a number. Anybody? Yes. What's your number? 15%. Thanks, David. Thanks, David. Anybody else? Fully covered, but in terms of the coverage of actual self-employed in TCI, do you have a sense of how much you actually have? Roughly? Not a sense yet. Anybody else?
I would like to believe it has a 100%.
100%. Yes. This must be the miracle of the century. In terms of actual self-employed people.
We have better compliance with self-employed than with employed.
Really?
Yes.
No, we need to look at what you're doing. We need to look at the BVI model because typically we always have issues with employers established. But at least you know where they are. You could find them. With the self-employed, typically.
And as a result of the implementation of NHI,
yes.
those who are not compliant have to apply because they don't report for NHI.
Right. And that takes me, thank you very much, because that takes me, when I mention incentives, remember I said compliance and incentives, that is an example of incentives. In other words, they now have an incentive to comply because there's a benefit to be derived. And health is important for everybody. Let's think about that. And perhaps in the discussions later on today and the next few days, you might be able to distill some lessons there because coverage has to improve in our countries. And to improve coverage, we have to be able to get the self-employed. And you know what concerns me? Again, harping back to my days as financial secretary, but even now at the central bank, or the example that Mr. Bailey gave with the fisherman, when there is a problem, all roads lead to government, social security. So if we don't plan now and make steps to manage that process now, we are still going to have to manage it later, perhaps at an inopportune time. So we need to create an incentive there for people to get involved. Aging population, I think we all know what that means for us in the region, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. High levels of unemployment. That concerns me, as it concerns all of us. And within our region, we're not simply talking about high unemployment, but we're talking about high unemployment, especially amongst our youth. In fact, typically, I could certainly speak for the ECCU, where the national unemployment rate, youth doubles the national rate of unemployment. So if that rate is 20%, for youth it is 40%. The work that ILO has done suggests that about 40% of the nations, of the global youth population, 15 to 24, I think, or 30-something, is in fact unemployed. So that's a huge issue for us in the Caribbean. And of course, beyond the wasted potential and so on and possibilities, we are all very concerned about what? The social pathologies that are emerging. Crime, deviant behavior, domestic abuse and violence, and all those issues. And therefore, we have to concern ourselves with that. So that when, I think it was Reggie, Mr. Thomas spoke earlier, I want to make the point to you, social security heads. This requires you to move from simply being administrators to being activists. Activists. You have to be engaged in public policy. You have to be engaged in public policy because you are the custodians of the most important social protection program in the region. So you must be engaged in health policy. You must be engaged in labor market policies. You must be engaged in policies for the aged. You must be engaged in youth policy. You can't be innocent bystanders hoping for the best. Too much is at stake. And you know too much to be silent. So we have to put on our hard hats and we have to get more engaged in public policy on these issues. Understanding that it takes us right back to sustainability of the programs we manage. So when the minister spoke about fiduciary responsibility, that is part of our fiduciary responsibility. You know, I grew up in a time in the public service, the prior generation in the public service was stay below the radar, don't say anything, don't let anybody see you. That has changed. And I've challenged that issue with public servants, especially at the senior level. Part of the job is not simply to advise. You know, the traditional role is policy advice, implementation. Well, I have argued that there's a first piece, which is policy dialogue. Policy dialogue. And senior public servants have to be engaged in policy dialogue. It is too important a role, with due respect, to be left only to our politicians. And I don't think they want us to leave them alone in that either. Now, I know very often our concern is the public response and all of that, but in public life, very often service requires us to see our higher responsibility. And when I was engaging on fiscal responsibility legislation or homegrown adjustment reforms in Grenada, for example, I understood that. It took some risks, perhaps, but I understood the need to get engaged with people on these issues and to face them and to... I'm sorry my Grenadian colleagues are not here because they can attest to some of that. So that requires a different role, from administrator to activist. But understand you're not doing it for yourself. It's not about you. It's not about you. It's about the people that you serve, in whose name you must act as custodians of social security programs and reserves. Let's move on. Transitioning, sorry, we'll get there in a minute. Transitioning to, all right, we'll get there shortly. Transitioning to digital economy and changing labor markets. The global economy is changing. I think it was the Reggie who spoke earlier on about Uber being charged. But I know in Europe, they are now looking at charging electronic persons. holding them accountable to pay a contribution. Taxi hailing apps, services, they are also being asked to make a contribution. In other words, we have to recognize the labor market has changed. We have to recognize the players, the gig economy, as it is called, the share economy, as it is called, where people are doing this part-time work. And we have to engage. So in some countries, rather than looking for days and weeks and months, they look for hours. And they work out an arrangement where you make your contribution. So we have to adapt to that. So if the law does not allow us to do that, the law needs to change to allow us to do that. But we have to move with the times. And then, of course, shocks. Global, geopolitical, climatic range of shocks, all of which speak to the need for appropriate business continuity. And by the way, I noticed on the program that you have cybersecurity down as one of the issues, and I'm glad to see that, because when you ask any central banker what keeps them up at night, cybersecurity is either 1 or 2 on that list. What keeps you guys up at night, heads of Social Security? What keeps you up at night? Always up. All right, always up. I heard somebody say, the Lord gives his beloved sleep, so I sleep in. Yeah, I think we all are exercise, and I'm sure our ministers in their own way, with either their constituency or their portfolio, also at times are up at night, thinking about how they could serve, how they will meet the challenges of the day. So many demands, limited resources. Even here in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is perhaps better endowed than some, there are limitations. We understand that. So how do we respond? So that leads me to get to some recommendations before I wrap up. But I like this quote, one of my favorites, by Jack Welch. If the rate of change outside is faster than the rate of change inside, the end is in sight. The first time I heard that, I loved it so much I memorized it instantly. And I've said it in the bank so often that probably they've... But it's so important. As leaders, we have to constantly be looking at the environment, the operating environment, and being prepared to read the times and to make that shift in a timely fashion. You know, we're not just managers, we're leaders, and leaders have to manage complexity. Dynamic changes, that's part of leadership. If the rate of change is faster outside than inside, the end is in sight. And that is true for any business, and it's certainly true for Social Security schemes, if we do not make the requisite adjustments. So we need to do that. We need to do that. So a few recommendations, and I conclude. These are standard parametric reforms. This is not breaking news. You've seen those. You've advocated for those, and I join my voice in advocacy. We need to raise the statutory age to tie it to life expectancy. Some of the schemes have already done that, but I am aware that there are some schemes that are still at 60. Still at 60. So while I think Barbados is now at, what, 67? As of 2018, I think, thereabouts. Some are still at 60. Some have moved to 62 and so on. We need to move the age, and let's do it in a gradual way. So even if you say, no, it depends on your circumstance. So these are general recommendations. You have to adjust and calibrate depending on the country, the scheme, the particular scheme. But as an example, if you're at 60 now, can you get to 65 over the next 10 years by going up 1 year every 2 years? That's one option to consider. But make the adjustment. And do it in a way that, you know, we don't jump from 60 to 65 in one go. And in doing that, we should always provide options for earlier retirement. So if people still want to go at 60, they can go, but with reduced benefits. We should try and be flexible where that is concerned. Increased contributions. Some of us have not adjusted contributions for a long time, and my concern is that we're going to wait too long and then have to make a very drastic adjustment. I like what I think Dominica, where you do a 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. I like that. Because I think, you know, you can get there gradually, slowly, but surely. as opposed to waking up one morning and saying, right, 5% increase. You know how that will go. And I say that because, I am sensitive to the political economy as well and whatever is going on. The trouble is, as I've discovered in public life, timing is not always easy to determine because we say, well, no, it's not the right time. Maybe next year, maybe the following year, maybe right after elections. The problem is we don't know when the hurricane will come.
That's right.
We don't know what will happen with the global economy. So we make our plans with our own mindset and our own understanding, but there are certain things we do not control. And my concern is when we delay and defer, we are inviting other elements outside of our control to impact the decision that we're making. And we may find that we have even less room for maneuver at the time when we are forced to make decisions than if we had made it earlier. So that's why I've always said to my ministers and prime ministers I serve, I know timing is an issue, I understand that. But if you're in government long enough, you're going to discover that decisions that you deferred in your first term will come back to haunt you in your second term or third. And then you'll say, shucks, I wish I had done that earlier. I've seen it over and over. I speak from experience, And I understand the challenges of policy, I really do. But there are some things where we need to take the nation along, take them into our confidence, and make the adjustment in a gradual but deliberate way, rather than leaving it. And some people say, well, and that's not just for politicians, even sometimes in Social Security. If you're close to retirement, you might say, well, why am I hurting my head now? I'm about to leave. I'll leave that for the next guys. The trouble is that you are expecting to get a pension in retirement. So you better have to take care of your retirement by doing what you have to do now. And when I hear our people, including our politicians, talk about, and I know Minister Amory will not mind me talking about politicians. I'm not beating up on them. I'm engaging them because they are very important players in this, along with ourselves. Like to talk about our children and grandchildren, our children's children. Hello? Social Security is about children and our children's children. Because we're making commitments for 60 years down the road. Now and beyond. And that is an example of where we really need a long view. And we need to take the action early. So I want to suggest that. One area that I didn't mention, but I want to mention very briefly, is the idea of introducing an unemployment benefit. Some countries have it, I think Bahamas, Barbados, maybe others. I seriously want us to consider that. And some of you are saying, well, the timing. Well, let's figure it out. Because a couple of things, obviously. One is that we have high unemployment. And potentially, if we're able to offer that benefit, it will do two things. It will engage our young people very early in a way that potentially could get them in the right track. And simultaneously, speaking for government now, it might help government to rationalize some of its own sustainability issues with some of its youth programs, of which there are challenges. I don't need to go into that now. But in addition to that, what I've observed in Grenada after Hurricane Ivan, in Anguilla after Hurricane Irma in Anguilla's case, is the need for unemployment benefits in the short term. Because I think, Tim, you had to do some unemployment benefits after Hurricane Irma. Right. And the point is that in many cases, these are not funded. Certainly in Grenada's case, it was not. But it was, a need, and the scheme with government needed to be responsive. But if you do that after 2 or 3 hurricanes, that has an effect on the reserves. So my thinking is that we perhaps need to move towards introducing a benefit, those of you who don't have it. Modest, it has to be paid for, so it will have to be a small contribution to go with that. And it could be done at the same time when you're making the adjustment, so it's not 2 and 3 discussions, but it's one discussion. Something to think about. A couple more, and I'll conclude. So in terms of some general recommendations now, I am recommending that the governments adopt fiscal responsive legislation, what I refer to as fiscal resilience legislation. And I spoke to that earlier. I'm also advocating that each country prepares a time-bound action plan for implementing reforms. That has to be a joint approach with the governments and social security schemes. But I'm advocating that that be done and published so that in the same way that the ECCB has done a strategic plan, and every year as part of our annual report, we must now present on progress. In the same way that the government of St. Kitts and Nevis has a manifesto, and it is publishing its results based on promises made and promises kept, in the same way, we must have governments and Social Security publish and report progress. Everybody's on board. Everybody understands what this is all about. We bring a level of transparency and ownership to the process if we do that. I spoke about timeliness of publishing statements, and I want to just underscore that. And also, finally, cooperation along the lines of corporate governance, research and development for public policy, and investment. So at ECCB, we are now considering, for the first time, the use of a limited portion of reserves for economic development. Now, that is enshrined in the ECCB agreement, Article 42. It has never been done. There's a reason why it's put there. And so it is my responsibility now as government to explore and to put advice to the Monetary Council ultimately on the potential use of a limited portion of reserves. So if you go to a strategic plan, you will see it there. Now I want to be clear, we obviously are going to be prudent. As we speak, the reserves, the backing of the EC dollar is around 97.5%. The law requires us to be at 60. Operationally, we work with 80%. So we are well backed. A limited portion of the reserves would probably mean us using 5–10% of that amount. So we at, say, 97, we go down to, say, 87. We're still well above our operational limit as well as our legal limit. And deploy that for transformative activities, economic development. We're looking actively at that right now. I put it to Social Security schemes. You may want to partner with us in this endeavor. If we are prepared to invest reserves for economic development to help transform our region, is that something you would consider? You don't have to answer me now. My point is, when you talk about thinking outside of the box, Minister, that's an example. But we have to do it thoughtfully, and we have to do it collaboratively. So that is something that we're looking at right now. A few weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. Coming out of our investment forum in March, I approached the World Bank Treasury. Would you be willing to help us with two things? One, do some pool investments to help us address the investment issue in terms of the diversification challenge. So we're not going to take all the money out of the region, but we do need to diversify. Everybody understand that? That's in all our actuarial reports. Can we come together to do this? Because my concern right now is that a couple of the Social Security schemes are doing it, but at significant costs. And when you look at the costs for the money managers and the returns, we might be ticking the box of diversification, but we're not ticking the box of yield and cost effectiveness. Can we come together? The World Bank said to me, Governor, of course, if your Social Securities want us to do that, we are prepared to work with you. They do it all over the world for all sorts of countries. Even at the central bank, we have some of our reserves invested with the World Bank Treasury, through the World Bank Treasury. They're one of our external money managers. At the end of the day, if you want to do it, we'll do it. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. I also said, would you be prepared to come and work with our boards and investment committees to build additional capacity as part of strengthening our corporate governance and strengthening our ability to manage our reserves and so on? And again, the answer was, if you want us to do it, we'll design a program for you. So Social Security schemes, since March, I have been following up on some of our discussions. At the end of the day, I'm here to serve. We're here to serve. We're in it together. If you're interested, then we can go forward. So let me conclude. Let me conclude. There's an old Chinese proverb that says the following. Oops. All right, that's it. If we don't change direction, we are likely to end up where we are headed. If we don't change direction, we are likely to end up where we are headed. Where are we headed right now? Some of our schemes are on track to insolvency. Expenditure is already exceeding contribution income, and in some of our schemes, expenditure is exceeding total income, both contribution and investment. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? The positive development impact of social security schemes on our region is undeniable. However, some of our schemes are now unsustainable. Mr. Minister, ministers, CARICOM heads of social security, given the current track to insolvency, we must change direction without delay. Delay will inevitably mean drastic and draconian action when the situation reaches crisis proportions. We can and must avoid that. With our collective efforts and energies, we can overcome these challenges and make good on our social contract, not only for now, but for many years to come. Please therefore accept my best wishes for not just a successful meeting, but for a fruitful one, because our region depends on you. So what's my final word? Fiscal resilience framework, sense of urgency, collective action now. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.